The briefing had already started by the time they let Sergeant Emmett Coyle into the room. Not because he was late. He had been standing outside the compartment hatch for 11 minutes, holding his data pad and his observer credentials, waiting for someone to key the access panel. The hatch required authorization from any crew member of the Drethani strike carrier Pale Convergence, and the 2 sentries flanking it, amphibian-skinned soldiers with mottled teal hides and the reflective horizontal pupils of deep ocean predators, had looked at his credentials, looked at each other, and then looked at a point approximately 6 inches above his head, as though the problem might resolve itself if they waited long enough. Coyle had waited with them. He was good at waiting. 43 days aboard this carrier had taught him that the Drethani relationship with time was different from humanity's, not slower, exactly, but denser, layered with a patience that came from evolving in deep water where the difference between a meal and a predator was often nothing more than who could hold still longer. They did not rush. They processed. They assessed. And when they decided something was beneath the threshold of consequence, they processed and assessed that too, at exactly the same deliberate pace. The hatch opened eventually because someone inside needed to leave, a Drethani communications officer who paused mid-stride when she saw Coyle, checked his credentials against her wrist display, and then gestured him through with the wet flick of a membrane-covered hand that translated roughly as "Go ahead, I suppose." Coyle had heard that phrase in various Drethani dialects and posture inflections more than any other during his assignment. It was not hostility. It was something more complete than hostility. It was the institutional expression of irrelevance. The briefing room was a low-ceilinged oval lined with tactical displays that cast the space in shifting blue light. 18 Drethani officers sat in curved alcoves arranged around a central holographic projection table, their amphibian bodies settled into the shallow pools of temperature-regulated fluid that served as their seating. The fluid was a pale amber, nutrient-enriched, thermoregulated to within a fraction of a degree, and formulated specifically for each cast's dermal requirements. The Drethani were water-adapted, not aquatic, but evolved from a species that had never fully committed to land. Their skin was smooth, dense, and perpetually damp, ranging from dark teal to pale green depending on rank and caste. Their eyes were large, laterally placed, with reflective membranes that caught the tactical display light and threw it back in brief silver flashes whenever they turned their heads. They were built for patience, for stillness, for the kind of predatory waiting that could last hours without a twitch. Commander Sethal Vor sat at the head of the table. She was the tallest Drethani in the room, 6.5 feet of lean amphibian muscle sheathed in a tactical membrane that fit her like a second skin, her hide the dark teal-black of deep water, her eyes reflecting the holographic projection, with the flat intensity of someone who had been commanding strike operations since before Coyle had been born. 4 parallel scars ran along her left flank, pale against the dark hide, old, healed, displayed without comment. Her forelimbs were folded across her thorax in the posture that Coyle had catalogued over 6 weeks as professional neutrality, not hostile, not welcoming, simply present. She did not look at Coyle when he entered. Nobody did. He found the seat they had assigned him. It was in the back row, behind the last alcove, outside the arc of the projection table's display field. It was dry. A standard chair, the kind used for visiting dignitaries and maintenance inspections, functional, temporary, and designed to communicate that the person sitting in it was not part of the operational conversation. The manifest designation for the seat was supernumerary, a word Coyle had looked up on his first day, and then looked up again on his second day, because the first definition had seemed too precise to be accidental. Supernumerary. A person or thing beyond the required or desired number. Furniture with a pulse. Coyle sat down, opened his data pad and began taking notes. The briefing concerned a reconnaissance sweep of a contested debris field in the Kelly's corridor, a narrow transit lane between 2 territorial boundaries that had been claimed by the Drethani Compact, disputed by the Selvari hegemony, and largely ignored by everyone else for the better part of a decade. Recent Selvari fleet movements had changed the calculation. Intelligence suggested the hegemony was positioning sensor platforms inside the debris field passive collection, arrays that would give them real-time tracking of every Drethani vessel transiting the corridor. The mission was straightforward. A Drethani strike team of 6 operators would deploy in light assault craft, sweep the debris field, locate and disable the Selvari sensor platforms, and extract before the hegemony's patrol rotation brought fresh eyes to the corridor. Estimated duration, 14 hours. Estimated opposition, minimal. The Selvari relied on concealment, not defense. The platforms were hidden, not guarded. Commander Vore outlined the operation with the economical precision of someone who had done this kind of work 100 times. Her voice was low, steady, and carried the particular authority of an officer who did not raise it. She walked through the deployment formation, the 3-craft spread, the sensor sweep protocol, the extraction triggers, and the communications discipline required in a corridor where the Selvari might have passive listeners seated in the debris. Every officer in the room followed along on their alcove displays, annotating their own operational copies with the fluid tapping motions of their membrane-covered digits. Coyle wrote everything down. He noted the deployment formation, the sweep pattern, the extraction timeline, the communications protocols, the contingency triggers. He noted the 6 operators by name and position. He noted the debris field's composition, mineral-heavy asteroid fragments from a collision event 900 years old, ranging from pebble-sized to 3 kilometers across, moving in slow, predictable orbits that had been charted and recharted by Drethani navigators for generations. He also noted something that nobody in the room mentioned. The debris field's orbital chart was 11 months old. He checked it twice. The navigational data loaded into the holographic projection was stamped with a survey date of 11 months prior. The debris field was stable. It had been stable for centuries, but stable was not static. 900 years of slow orbital mechanics meant the fragments drifted, and 11 months of drift in a field that dense could shift gap widths, shadow angles, and sensor occlusion zones by margins that mattered when you were flying light assault craft through it at combat speed. Coyle opened a note on his pad and flagged it. Then he flagged something else. The Selvari sensor platforms, according to intelligence, were passive. Passive meant they collected data without transmitting in real time. They stored it and uploaded in compressed bursts at scheduled intervals to a relay satellite outside the field. The briefing identified 4 suspected platform locations based on signal pattern analysis of those bursts. But the burst pattern analysis assumed the relay satellite was stationary. Coyle pulled up the corridor's public traffic log, available to any coalition member with observer clearance, and found 3 scheduled Selvari commercial transits through the corridor in the past 11 months. Any one of those transits could have served as a mobile relay, collecting stored data from the platforms without the fixed position burst that the Drethani analysts had been tracking. Which meant the platforms might not be where the intelligence said they were, or there might be more of them, or fewer. The 4-target estimate was built on an assumption that nobody had tested because nobody had looked at the commercial traffic logs, because commercial traffic logs were not intelligence data. They were shipping records. The kind of information that sat in a public database and waited for someone to connect it to a question it had never been asked. Coyle flagged this too. He did not raise his hand. He did not clear his throat. He had been assigned to the Pale Convergence as a coalition military observer, a role that the Drethani Compact had agreed to as part of a broader diplomatic arrangement with Earth's Combined Fleet Command, and that Commander Vore had accepted with the visible enthusiasm of someone, told that a piece of furniture would be delivered to her briefing room, and she was not allowed to move it. His orders were specific: observe, record, report through coalition channels, do not interfere with operational planning. Do not offer tactical input unless directly asked. Do not attempt to integrate into the strike team's chain of command. Nobody had directly asked. Nobody had indirectly asked. Nobody had asked in any form, inflection, or posture language that Coyle's increasingly detailed understanding of Drethani communication could detect. He was a chair in the back row, and chairs did not contribute to briefings. The briefing ended. The 6 operators filed out to prep their craft. Commander Vore remained at the projection table, reviewing the sweep pattern with her executive officer, a stocky Drethani named Tauven, whose pale green hide was marked with the geometric tattoos of the compact's engineering cast. Tauven was built differently from the other officers, shorter, broader, with the dense musculature of someone who had spent years working in high-gravity fabrication environments before moving to fleet operations. His hands were thick and scarred, and he handled his data displays with the careful precision of a man who knew his fingers could break the things he touched if he was not deliberate about it. Coyle stood, tucked his data pad under his arm, and walked to the projection table. He stopped at a distance that was respectful but visible close enough that ignoring him would require a conscious decision. Vore's horizontal pupils tracked to him without her head moving. The reflective membranes caught the light and threw back a brief flash of silver. She waited. The Drethani did not prompt conversation. They simply created a space in which conversation could happen, and then observed whether anything filled it. "Commander," Coyle said, "the orbital survey data in the navigation package is 11 months old." Vore studied him for 3 seconds. Her expression did not change. Drethani faces were not built for the kind of mobile expression that humans use to signal emotion. Their communication ran through posture, membrane color shifts, and the positioning of the gill slits along their necks. Vore's gill slits were flat and closed, which Coyle had learned meant either calm assessment or active dismissal, and the difference between the two was a matter of context he did not have. "The Kelly's debris field has been charted for 400 years, Vore said. "Its orbital mechanics are predictive to within 0.03% variance per standard cycle." "Yes, ma'am. 0.03% of the field's total mass envelope is approximately 200 metric tons of positional drift over 11 months. In a field this dense, that's enough to shift gap profiles by 12 to 18 meters in the sweep corridors your operators will be using." Vore's gill slits opened a fraction. Tauven, beside her, produced a sound that Coyle's translator rendered as the Drethani equivalent of an amused exhale, the kind of noise someone made when a pet did something unexpectedly clever. 12 meters of gap variance, Vore said, in corridors rated for craft with a 4-meter beam. You are suggesting our navigators cannot manage an 8-meter margin. "No, ma'am. I'm noting that the margin exists and wasn't mentioned in the briefing." "Because it does not require mentioning. The margin is within operational tolerance." "Understood." He stood there. Vore watched him. The silence had a texture, the particular weight of a commanding officer deciding whether to dismiss a subordinate with words or simply by returning to work. Tauven's thick fingers had stopped moving on his display. He was watching too, with the expression of someone observing a small creature approach a large one, and wondering whether the interaction would be educational or just brief. "Your observation is logged," Vore said. She turned back to the projection table. The dismissal was not unkind. It was simply complete, a door closing with professional finality, the sound of a category being confirmed. Coyle walked back to his chair, sat down, and opened his data pad. He pulled up the corridor traffic log again and began cross-referencing Selvari transit schedules with the burst pattern analysis windows. The work was methodical, patient, and exactly the kind of data assembly that nobody had assigned him to do because nobody had imagined he would do it. His orders said observe and record. They did not specify what to observe, or how deeply to record, or what to do with the observations once they were made. Over the next 4 hours, he did what he had been assigned to do. He observed. He observed the 6 operators prepping their craft in the carrier's launch bay, 3 two-seat light assault vehicles, fast and agile, designed for the kind of close quarters maneuvering that debris field operations required. The Drethani were meticulous. Every system check was performed twice. Every weapon was inspected, stowed, and verified against a manifest that was itself verified against a master list held by the Bay Chief, a veteran named Kelth whose hide was so scarred it had gone almost white in patches. He observed the operators' interactions, the shorthand, the posture signals, the way they moved around each other with the unconscious coordination of people who had trained together for years. He noted which operator deferred to which, where the informal hierarchy diverged from the formal one, which pairs communicated with glances and which needed words. He noted that operator Selvan, the mid-rank tactician with dark teal hide and quick, precise movements, checked her weapon 3 times instead of twice, and that the third check was not on the manifest. A personal habit. The kind of ritual that developed over years of operational work, invisible to everyone except someone whose only job was to watch. He observed the maintenance logs. The Drethani were thorough about maintenance. They logged everything, updated everything, flagged everything. The assault craft were in excellent condition. The weapons systems were current. The navigation packages were loaded and verified. The navigation packages used the 11-month-old survey data. He noted it. He did not mention it again. At hour 6, the strike team launched. Coyle watched from the carrier's operations center, a tiered room with curved display walls that showed real-time telemetry from each craft. He sat in his assigned position, rear row, dry chair, outside the operational arc and recorded. The first 2 hours of the sweep were clean. The 3 assault craft entered the debris field in a staggered formation, each one taking a designated sector, moving through the mapped corridors with the fluid precision of pilots who knew their craft and trusted their charts. The debris field was a graveyard of ancient stone, dark, mineral-dense fragments tumbling in slow procession against the faint glow of the corridor's boundary stars. The craft moved through it, the way fish moved through a reef, following gaps that the charts said were there. Coyle watched the telemetry and compared it to the 11-month-old survey in real time. For the first 90 minutes, the variance was negligible. The debris field was stable. 0.03% was functionally invisible at the macro scale. At the micro scale, in the narrow corridors between the larger fragments, it was not invisible. It was 12 to 18 meters of positional shift, exactly as Coyle had calculated. The gaps were still passable. The margins were still adequate. But they were not the margins the pilots were expecting. And at combat speed, the difference between an 18-meter gap and a 16-meter gap was the difference between comfortable and careful. Assault Craft 1's pilot made a minor course correction at a point where the chart showed open space and reality showed a fragment that had drifted 14 meters closer to the corridor's centerline. The correction was smooth, professional, unconscious, the kind of adjustment a skilled pilot made without thinking about it. Nobody in the operations center commented on it. Nobody except Coyle noted it on his pad with the annotation. Drift confirmed, corridor 7, 14-meter offset. At hour 3 of the sweep, Assault Craft 2 reported contact. Operator Selvan identified a magnetic anomaly consistent with a Selvari passive sensor platform. It was embedded in the surface of a large fragment, concealed beneath a layer of mineral dust that matched the surrounding rock within the spectral tolerance of a standard visual scan. It would have been invisible to anyone who was not specifically looking for it, which was the point. The team converged on the location. Selvan confirmed the platform's signature, disabled it with a focused electromagnetic pulse that wiped its data buffer and scrambled its collection firmware, and logged the coordinates. Vor, monitoring from the operations center, authorized the team to proceed to the second predicted location. Coyle, in his back row chair, was looking at something else. He had been running the Selvari transit cross-reference for 4 hours. The results were not conclusive, but they were suggestive. 2 of the 3 Selvari commercial transits through the corridor in the past 11 months had passed within relay range of this section of the debris field, close enough to collect stored data from platforms without the fixed position burst that the Drethani analysts had based their location estimates on. Which meant this platform, the one Selvan had just found, might have been uploading through mobile relay for nearly a year, which meant its data buffer might have been emptied regularly by passing freighters. Which meant finding it here confirmed nothing about whether the intelligence estimate of 4 platforms was correct, because the estimate was based on burst frequency from a fixed relay, and the actual upload mechanism might be completely different. There could be more. There could be fewer. The 4-platform estimate was built on a foundation that had a crack in it, and the crack was not in the data, it was in the assumption beneath the data. Coyle opened a new note and wrote, "Platform count estimate may be unreliable. Mobile relay hypothesis supported by transit log correlation. Recommend expanded sweep radius." He did not send it to anyone. His orders were observe and record. But he did something else. Something small, within the narrow bounds of what an observer was authorized to do. He pulled up the debris field's mineral composition data, publicly available, part of the corridor's standard navigation package, accessible to anyone with coalition credentials down to and including a non-essential observer in a dry chair, and cross-referenced it with the magnetic signature of the platform Selvan had found. The platform was concealed by mineral dust, but it was a technological object embedded in a natural surface. Its magnetic signature was distinct from the surrounding rock by a margin that was tiny but measurable, a deviation of 0.004% from the baseline mineral signature of the host fragment. Coyle wrote a filter, a simple algorithm, 11 lines of code on his personal data pad, that compared the platform's known magnetic profile against the debris field's background readings and flagged any fragment surface that showed a similar deviation. It was the kind of analysis that a dedicated signals intelligence team would run as a matter of course with classified sensor arrays and purpose-built analytical tools. It was not the kind of analysis that a military observer sitting in a dry chair in the back row of an operations center was expected to perform on a personal data pad using publicly available geological survey data. The filter returned 9 hits. 9 fragment surfaces in the debris field showed magnetic deviations consistent with concealed technological objects. 4 of them matched the intelligence estimate's predicted locations. 5 did not. Coyle's fingers paused on his data pad. He checked the filter's parameters, adjusted the noise threshold upward to account for natural magnetic variation in iron-rich mineral deposits, and ran it again. 7 hits, 4 matched, 3 did not. He ran it a third time with tighter tolerances, excluding any deviation that could plausibly be explained by the known geological properties of the debris field's parent body. 6 hits, 4 matched, 2 were new. 2 additional platforms, or at least 2 additional technological objects, embedded in fragment surfaces that the intelligence estimate had not predicted, in locations the sweep pattern would not cover. He sat with this for 45 seconds. His orders were specific: observe, record, report through coalition channels, do not offer tactical input unless directly asked. Nobody was asking. The operations center hummed with the quiet professionalism of a well-run command, every officer focused on telemetry and extraction timelines, and the procedural rhythm of a mission that was proceeding exactly according to plan. The plan that accounted for 4 platforms. The strike team was converging on the second predicted platform location. Operators moved through the debris corridors with professional ease, their craft threading gaps that the charts said were wide enough, and that were, in fact, wide enough, even with the 11-month drift. The operation was proceeding on schedule. The team was competent, disciplined, and operating on intelligence they trusted. The intelligence was incomplete. Coyle stood up from his chair, walked to the operations center's communication station, and did the only thing his authorization allowed. He submitted a formal observer's note, the diplomatic equivalent of a footnote, a mechanism designed to let coalition observers record concerns without disrupting operations. The note was time-stamped, logged in the ship's record, and routed to Commander Vor's secondary display, not her primary tactical display, which showed mission-critical information, but the secondary one, which collected administrative notices, maintenance updates, and other items that the commanding officer could review at her discretion. It read, "Observer's note: magnetic deviation analysis of debris field surfaces identifies 2 additional anomalies consistent with concealed sensor platforms at coordinates attached. Analysis methodology and raw data attached. Submitted for the record." For the record, not for action, not as a recommendation, not as tactical input, just a note filed by a non-essential observer in the back row for whatever it was worth. The quietest possible way to say I found something without saying you missed something. Coyle sat back down. Vor did not look at her secondary display for 22 minutes. She was managing the sweep monitoring Selvon's approach to the second platform, coordinating the third craft's positioning for the next target in the sequence, tracking the extraction timeline against the Selvari patrol rotation window. She was busy with the mission as it existed in the plan. The note sat in her queue behind 3 operational updates and a maintenance flag from the carrier's engineering section. When she opened it, Coyle saw her gill slits flare. It was a small movement, the Drethani equivalent of a human's eyebrows rising involuntary, quickly controlled, visible only to someone who was watching for it. Someone who had spent 43 days on this carrier learning to read the small signals, because nobody was talking to him, and reading small signals was all he had. Vor studied the note for 11 seconds. Her horizontal pupils moved across the attached data, the filter parameters, the hit coordinates, the cross-reference methodology, with the mechanical thoroughness of someone who evaluated data for a living, and had suddenly encountered data from a source she had not imagined would produce any. Then she did something Coyle had not expected. She turned to Tauvin and spoke in low Drethani that Coyle's translator caught in fragments. "The observer's filter. Run it through the tactical suite. Full resolution." Tauvin's pale green hide shifted a shade darker embarrassment. Coyle had learned, or irritation, or both. The engineering cast officer's thick fingers moved across his console with deliberate precision, pulling up Coyle's filter parameters, loading them into the ship's tactical analysis suite, a system with classified sensor resolution that could read magnetic signatures 3 orders of magnitude finer than the public navigation package, and ran the same algorithm with the carrier's full-resolution sensor data. The tactical suite returned 8 hits. 4 matched the intelligence estimate, 4 did not. 4 additional concealed platforms that the sweep pattern would not reach. The operations center went quiet in a way Coyle recognized. Not the quiet of routine, the quiet of recalculation. Officers who had been monitoring telemetry with the relaxed attention of people watching a procedure they had seen 100 times were now leaning forward, reading their displays with the sharpened focus of people who had just learned that the map was wrong. Gill slits opened across the room in an involuntary cascade, the Drethani physiological response to new threat data, as automatic as a human's pupils dilating. Vor stood. The movement was slow, controlled, the deliberate rise of a predator that did not need to rush because it had already decided what to do. "Recall Craft 3 to holding position," she said. Selvan, continue disable on Platform 2. Craft 1, hold at current coordinates. Taven relayed the orders. The operators acknowledged without question, no hesitation, no request for clarification, the trained response of professionals who understood that when the commander changed the plan mid-sweep, there was a reason, and the reason would be explained when the commander was ready to explain it. Vor walked to the rear of the operations center. She stopped in front of Coyle's chair. Her horizontal pupils were level with his, which meant she was bending slightly, not deference but deliberate positioning, the Drethani equivalent of making eye contact to ensure the conversation carried the weight she intended. "Your filter," she said. "Yes, Commander. You built it on publicly available data. The mineral composition dataset in the standard navigation package." "Yes." "The tactical suite confirms 4 additional platforms. Your filter, run on limited data, found 2 of them. The suite found all 4. The public data has lower resolution. The filter's methodology is sound. The input was the constraint." Vor's gill slits opened and closed once. The reflective membranes in her eyes caught the display light and held it. "Why did you not raise this before the sweep launched?" "I hadn't finished the analysis before launch. The transit log cross-reference took time, and I didn't have the magnetic signature data until Selvan confirmed the first platform. Without a confirmed signature to calibrate the filter against, it was theoretical. You could have flagged the possibility." "I flagged the orbital survey age before the briefing ended. The underlying concern was the same. The intelligence picture might be incomplete. The survey data was one symptom. The platform count was another." Something moved across Vor's expression. Not her face, her posture. A fractional shift in the set of her shoulders, the angle of her head, the position of her scarred flank relative to him. It was the Drethani equivalent of a long look, the kind of reassessment that happened when a category needed updating, and the officer doing the updating was not entirely comfortable with the conclusion. "The orbital survey note," she said. "You were not commenting on navigation margins." "The margins were the immediate issue, but outdated data in one area usually means outdated data in others. The same team that skipped the survey refresh probably used the same assumptions in the intelligence estimate. And you spent 6 hours looking for the second gap." "I had 6 hours and a chair in the back row. The work was available." Vor studied him for another 3 seconds. Then she turned and walked back to the command position. Over her shoulder, without breaking stride, she said something that Coyle's translator rendered with the dry precision of a bureaucratic directive. "Move his chair forward." Tolven's hide flickered. He looked at Coyle, then at the chair, then at the gap between the last operational alcove and the projection table, a gap that had never contained furniture because it had never needed to. He gestured the wet flick of a membrane-covered hand that meant "go ahead, I suppose." The same phrase. A different meaning this time, by a margin as small and significant as 12 meters of positional drift. Coyle picked up his chair and moved it to where he could see the tactical display. The sweep pattern was revised. The 3 assault craft were redirected to cover the expanded target set 8 platforms instead of 4. The extraction timeline was pushed back by 2 hours, which narrowed the window before the Selvari patrol rotation, which added risk that Vor absorbed without comment and communicated to her operators with nothing more than a revised timeline and the calm, flat expectation that they would perform within it. Coyle watched the operators work from his new position. They were good. Better than good, they were the kind of practitioners who made difficult things look routine, because they had done them so many times that the difficulty had been sanded away by repetition. Selvan disabled the 2nd and 3rd platforms with the calm efficiency of someone turning off light switches. The other operators navigated the debris corridors with the instinctive spatial awareness that came from years of flying in cluttered environments. adjusting for the gap variances that Coyle had predicted, and that had never quite risen to the level of a problem anyone else thought worth naming. They found the fifth platform, where Coyle's filter said it would be. The coordinates matched within 30 meters, not precise, given the resolution of the public data, but close enough that Selvon's craft found it in under 12 minutes of directed search. They found the sixth in a location that neither the intelligence estimate nor Coyle's filter had predicted, a bonus, discovered by operator Kelesh when her craft's proximity sensors flagged a magnetic anomaly on a fragment surface she was using as a navigation waypoint. The platform was newer than the others, installed recently enough that the mineral dust concealment was thinner. Kelesh disabled it and reported the finding with the flat professionalism of someone adding an item to a list that had already gotten longer than expected. They found the seventh platform 18 minutes later. This one was different. It was not passive. Operator Selvon reported the signature first. The magnetic profile matched the other platforms, but there was an additional component, a low-power active transmitter, cycling in a pattern that did not match any known Selvari communication protocol. It was not broadcasting outward toward the corridor's boundaries or the relay satellite's position. It was broadcasting inward into the debris field in a tight beam aimed at the corridor's interior transit lanes. Coyle was already writing when Vor looked at him. She looked at him, not at Tolven, not at her tactical officer, not at the intelligence analyst seated 3 alcoves to her left who was paid to interpret exactly this kind of finding. She looked at the human in the dry chair who had been right twice already. A trigger, Coyle said. It's a detection tripwire. When something crosses the beam, it logs the crossing and timestamps it. Size, speed, heading, electromagnetic signature, everything a craft puts out when it transits. A passive sweep of our corridor usage, Tolven said, his hide darkening as the implications settled. They're not just collecting environmental data, they're mapping our transit patterns. Which means they know this corridor better than the intelligence estimate assumed, Coyle said. They know when your patrols run, how many craft transit, which routes they favor, and what sensor profiles your assault craft present at operating speed. They've been building a pattern library. The operations center went very quiet. Not the recalculation quiet from before, something deeper. The silence of officers confronting the possibility that they had been observed without knowing it, that the watchers had been watched. Vor stood motionless for 6 seconds. Her gill slits were fully open, the membranes inside cycling through rapid flush patterns that Coyle had never seen before in 43 days of daily observation deep processing. He assessed, the Drethani physiological equivalent of a human pressing their lips together, and looking at the ceiling while they reorganized their entire understanding of the situation. The patrol rotation, she said. The window we calculated based on their published schedule may not reflect their actual rotation, Coyle said. If they've been mapping your transit patterns for months and that tripwire has been operational long enough to accumulate mineral dust, so it's not new, they may have adjusted their patrols to match your movements. The window might be narrower than we think, or it might not exist at all. They could be waiting for exactly this kind of incursion. Vor's horizontal pupils locked on the tactical display. She ran the timeline. Coyle could see her doing it. The way her eyes tracked across the display's elements, calculating distances and velocities and time to intercept without touching a console, performing in her head the kind of operational calculus that would have taken Coyle 10 minutes on his data pad, and that she completed in 6 seconds because she had been doing it for 30 years. Recall all craft, she said. Immediate extraction, priority route, widest corridors, maximum speed. Do not disable the active platform, leave it in place. Tolven's thick fingers transmitted the recall order. The operators responded instantly, no questions, no hesitation, No request for the reasoning behind an immediate extraction from a mission that had been proceeding successfully. Trust. The kind that was earned over years and spent in seconds. If we destroy it, Vor said, answering the question nobody had asked, they'll know we found it. If we leave it, we can feed it the transit data we want them to have. The tripwire becomes our tool. Coyle watched the three craft reverse course and accelerate toward the debris field's exit corridors. He watched the telemetry, the gap margins, the positional drift he had calculated 11 hours ago playing out in real time as the pilots navigated corridors that were 8 to 16 meters tighter than their charts predicted. They handled it. They were professionals. One pilot, Kellesh, in Craft 3, adjusted her approach vector to a corridor junction by 6 degrees without being told, compensating for a fragment that had drifted into the approach lane since the last survey. Coyle noted it. He noted everything. He also ran one more filter pass, because the active platform changed the equation. If the Selvari had placed an active tripwire in this section of the field, they might have placed others. The passive platforms and the active tripwire had different magnetic signatures. The active unit had a power source, which meant a faint thermal component layered over the magnetic deviation. The debris field was cold. Ambient temperature across the mineral fragments averaged 11 kelvins above absolute zero. A powered device, even a low-power one, would present a thermal contrast against that background. Coyle's data pad did not have thermal sensors, but the public navigation package included a thermal survey of the corridor, part of the standard geological dataset, intended for mining assessment, updated more frequently than the orbital survey because mining companies paid for current data and navies apparently did not. He ran the thermal deviation filter in parallel with the magnetic one. He found 2 more active tripwires. He flagged them in another observer's note, sent it to Vor's secondary display, and sat back in his chair. The note was formatted identically to the first one, time-stamped, methodology attached, coordinates attached, submitted for the record. The same quiet, bureaucratic format, the same footnote delivery mechanism, the same institutional understatement that said I found something without saying you missed something. Vor read it in under a minute this time. She did not turn around. She did not acknowledge the note verbally. She relayed the coordinates to the retreating craft without attribution, just coordinates, just data, woven into the extraction route adjustments as though they had come from the tactical suite. Avoid these positions. No explanation. The operators adjusted without asking. The 3 craft cleared the debris field 19 minutes before the revised window estimate. Whether the original window had been accurate, or whether the Selvari had already adjusted their patrol timing based on months of tripwire data, was a question that could not be answered from the operations center. It was a question that Coyle's analysis suggested had a troubling answer, and that Vor's expression, gill slits held carefully neutral, posture rigidly controlled, suggested she had already reached the same conclusion. The assault craft docked. The operators disembarked into the launch bay, moving with the controlled energy of professionals coming down from operational tempo. Selvan paused at the bay hatch, her teal hide glistening under the overhead lights, and looked at Coyle with the steady, evaluating gaze of a predator assessing something it had previously classified as scenery. She said nothing. She walked past him into the corridor, but her gill slits as she passed were in a configuration that Coyle had seen Drethani operators use only with each other. He filed it. He did not assign it meaning yet. Coyle went back to the operations center to write his observer's report, the formal document that would go through coalition channels, be read by analysts at Combined Fleet Command, and be filed in a database that nobody would search unless someone needed to justify a decision that had already been made. He was thorough. He included the orbital drift analysis, the transit log cross-reference, the mobile relay hypothesis, the magnetic filter methodology, the thermal deviation analysis, and the tripwire identification. He included every observation he had made, every note he had filed, every data point he had flagged. The report was 17 pages. His previous reports had averaged 3. He was halfway through the final section when Tauvin appeared at the hatch. "Commander Vor requests your presence in the tactical planning suite." Coyle closed his data pad. "When?" "Now." The tactical planning suite was a smaller room adjacent to the operations center, used for mission development and after-action review. When Coyle entered, Vor was standing at the suite's central table, her scarred flank toward the door, studying a projection of the Kelly's corridor with the expanded platform locations, all 8 confirmed passive platforms, plus the 3 active tripwires, plus the 2 additional anomalies from Coyle's final filter pass that had not yet been confirmed. 13 targets. The original intelligence estimate had identified 4. "Sit," Vor said without looking up. Coyle sat. The chair was at the table, not behind it. The same dry, standard-issue visitor's chair placed among the operational furniture as though it had been there all along. Vor studied the projection for another 30 seconds. Then she spoke. The Coalition Observer Program was proposed by the Human Diplomatic Delegation as a transparency mechanism. Every compact commander I have spoken to regards it as a political concession, a gesture that costs nothing because the observers are non-essential personnel seated outside the operational arc, recording information that will be filed in a database and never retrieved. She paused, her gill slits opened slowly. "I classified you the same way, non-essential, a diplomatic accessory. Your designation in the ship's manifest is supernumerary non-essential observer. I authored that designation personally. It was not the standard template. The standard template reads Coalition Observer attached. I added the supernumerary and the non-essential because I wanted the record to reflect my assessment. I'm aware of the designation. You identified an intelligence gap that my analysts missed. You built an analytical tool on limited public data that produced actionable results that my tactical suite confirmed and expanded. You identified an active monitoring network, the tripwire platforms that change the operational calculus of this mission and may change the strategic assessment of an entire corridor. You did all of this from a dry chair in the back row of my operations center, using a personal data pad and publicly available navigation data, while my own signals intelligence section sat 3 alcoves away with classified sensor arrays and produced nothing. Coyle said nothing. He waited. He was good at waiting, 43 days of practice. "I am not accustomed," Vor said, "to having my intelligence picture corrected by a footnote." It was an observer's note, different format. Vor's gill slits flared. Tauvin, standing by the door, produced a sound that Coyle's translator hesitated over and then rendered, reluctantly, as something between a cough and a laugh. The noise of a professional military officer confronting something that was undeniably funny in a way that military professionalism suggested he should not find funny. "I am revising your manifest designation," Vor said. "Effective immediately, you are reclassified from supernumerary, non-essential to attached tactical analyst, with secondary display access and direct channel communication authorization to the Operations Center duty officer." Coyle absorbed this. "My orders from Combined Fleet Command specify observer status only. I'm not authorized to accept an operational designation from a foreign command. Your orders specify that you observe, record, and report. I'm expanding the scope of what you observe and the speed at which your observations reach my operational staff. The classification is Drethani internal. Your coalition status is unchanged. You will continue to observe and record. The difference is that your observations will now reach operational staff in minutes instead of being filed in a 17-page report that arrives 3 weeks after the mission it describes. You're giving me a second title that lets me do the same job I was already doing, except now people will read my notes. Correct. That's a very Drethani solution. It is efficient, Vor said and turned back to the projection. After a moment she added without turning, the chair stays at the table. Coyle opened his data pad and began cataloging the 13 target locations against the corridor's full transit history. The work would take hours. The implications that the Selvari intelligence capability in the Kelly's corridor was 3 times what anyone had estimated, that their patrol adjustments might be based on months of detailed transit mapping, that the active monitoring network suggested a level of operational sophistication that the compact strategic assessments had not accounted for, that the entire corridor security classification needed to be rebuilt from the ground up, would take weeks to process through proper channels. But the data was there. It had always been there, in the public navigation packages, and the commercial transit logs, and the mineral composition surveys, and the thermal geological datasets that anyone with observer clearance could access. Nobody had looked at it because nobody had expected the observer to find anything worth looking at. The chair in the back row had been placed there to be empty, and nobody had checked whether the person sitting in it might be doing something other than sitting. Coyle worked through the next 4 hours without interruption. Operators passed through the planning suite on their way to debriefing, and some of them glanced at the human sitting at the tactical table, with the expression of people encountering a tool in an unexpected location, not alarmed, just mildly recalibrating their understanding of what the room contained. Selvon came in last. She stood in the doorway for a moment, her reflective eyes catching the blue light of the corridor projection, and looked at Coyle's data pad display the filter results, the transit correlations, the 13 target map that had grown from the original 4. The tripwire platforms, she said. If I had disabled the one I found, they would have known we detected their network. Probably. The pattern interruption would have been visible in their data the next time a mobile relay transited the corridor. The commander recalled us because of your analysis. The commander recalled you because the operational picture had changed. The analysis contributed. The decision was hers. Selvon's horizontal pupils narrowed. It was the Drethani equivalent of a squint, not suspicion, but focus. The look of a predator tracking something small that had just done something large. You were in the back row for 43 days, she said, watching. That's the job description. Watching us. Watching everything. You were part of everything. And you said nothing for 43 days. I said something today. Today you had something worth saying. Today the data was ready. It wasn't before. Selvon stood in the doorway for 5 more seconds. Then she performed a gesture that Coyle had seen Drethani operators perform only with each other, a slow extension of the membrane-covered hand, palm up, fingers spread, the gill slits along the forearm opening to expose the sensitive membranes beneath. It was not a handshake. It was not a salute. It was an acknowledgement between practitioners, the gesture that said, I work with you now, and I will know it the next time you speak. Coyle extended his hand in return. The gesture was imperfect, his hand was dry, his fingers were the wrong shape, and his palm did not have the sensory membranes that made the Drethani version a mutual exchange of tactile information. But Selvon held the contact for 3 seconds, her cool, damp skin against his dry, warm skin, and when she withdrew, her gill slits were in the configuration that Coyle had learned over 43 days of patient observation, meant respect. She walked away without another word. Coyle sat at the tactical table and continued his work. The Kelly's corridor projection glowed above him, 13 target markers pulsing in the blue-lit dark, each one a small piece of a picture that nobody had assembled until a non-essential observer in a dry chair had started watching. The formal after-action report was filed the following day. Commander Vor's official assessment noted the discovery of 9 additional sensor platforms beyond the original intelligence estimate, the identification of an active tripwire monitoring network that had been mapping Drethani transit patterns, and the revision of the corridor's security classification from contested to compromised. The report recommended a full intelligence reassessment of Selvari capability in all disputed corridor zones, and the immediate deployment of the magnetic thermal filter methodology to every corridor in the compact's operational territory. In the section reserved for personnel annotations, Vore added a single line. The manifest designation for Sergeant Emmett Coyle, human, previously classified as supernumerary non-essential observer, has been revised. See attached addendum. The addendum was 3 words: disregard previous classification. Coyle never saw the addendum. He was in the tactical planning suite, building a filter library for the next 6 corridors on the compact's disputed territory list, cross-referencing commercial transit logs with mineral surveys and thermal geological data and patrol rotation schedules, and every other piece of publicly available information that nobody had thought to assemble, because nobody had thought the observer would assemble anything. His chair was still at the table. It was still dry. It was still the standard-issue visitor's chair, not the fluid-filled alcoves that the Drethani operators used. It did not fit. It was not designed for the space. It was temporary furniture in a permanent room, placed there by someone who had expected it to remain empty. But it was at the table. And when the next briefing started, and the 18 officers settled into their alcoves, and the tactical displays lit up with the shifting blue light of another mission in another contested corridor, Commander Vore began with the operational overview, the deployment formation, the sweep pattern, the extraction timeline, the same economical precision she always used. And then, without pausing, without changing her tone, without any indication that what she was about to say was unusual or unprecedented, or the result of a 43-day reassessment of what the word observer could mean, when the person doing the observing had nothing to do but watch and the patience to do it well, she said, "Sergeant Coyle will present the supplementary intelligence assessment." 18 Drethani officers turned to look at the human in the dry chair. Coyle stood, walked to the projection table, and pulled up his filter results. The data appeared on the tactical display beside Vore's operational overlay, integrated into the briefing architecture as though it had always been there. He presented for 7 minutes, flat cadence, no inflection. The same voice he had used in the back row when nobody was listening, because it had always been the same voice. The only thing that had changed was who was listening to it. He flagged 3 discrepancies in the intelligence package, 2 gaps in the orbital survey, 1 anomaly in the corridor's commercial traffic pattern that suggested a Selvari logistics route nobody had mapped, and a thermal deviation cluster that was consistent with a second tripwire network in a corridor the compact had assessed as low priority. The room was quiet. When he finished, Vore nodded once. "Questions for the analyst?" Selvan raised a membrane-covered hand. "The thermal cluster, how long has it been there?" 14 months. I cross-referenced it against 6 databases. It's consistent across all of them. Nobody noticed for 14 months. Nobody was looking. The room stayed quiet for 3 more seconds. Then Tauven, at the engineering station, produced the sound, the reluctant almost laugh, the noise of a professional confronting something that was quietly, persistently funny in a way that defied protocol to acknowledge. Vore closed the briefing. The operators filed out. Coyle returned to his chair at the table, not behind it, and began updating his filter library with the new corridor's data. Nobody moved his chair back. Nobody ever discussed moving it back. And in the ship's manifest, under the entry for Sergeant Emmett Coyle, human, the original designation remained visible supernumerary, non-essential observer, with a single addendum notation appended by the commanding officer, copied to coalition records, and filed in the permanent archive of the Drethani Compact's operational history. 3 words, the quietest correction in the fleet's administrative record. Disregard previous classification.